Hello, for those of you who are new to the podcast and this YouTube channel, my name is John, and I am the host of the Beyond Belief Sobriety podcast. And what you're about to listen to and watch is a recording of a talk I gave at the Secular Overeaters Community Gathering on June 13th, 2021. They wanted me to talk about the history of secular Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and I did my best to take care of that in 20 minutes. This is followed by questions from the audience. Now, the introduction of me is cut off, but that is fine. I think that you might find this interesting, and please forgive me for any of the details that I may have gotten wrong, but I think for the most part it's fairly accurate. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Sorry, someone muted me, so I had to unmute. He has been actively involved with service to the secular AA community since attending a secular AA conference in November of 2014. His podcast, Beyond Belief Sobriety, has been serving the secular recovery community since September 2015. He is a certified peer support specialist in the state of Missouri and is involved in the recovery advocacy project in his state. He has been married for 15 years, and he and his wife, Susan, enjoy theater and travel. John will speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll have a short time for questions. John, would you like any timing reminders?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. Sometimes I will find myself going way longer than I need to, and sometimes I will just speak too fast and finish and not take all the time, but I'll do my best.
So do you want like 10 minutes, 15,
Yeah,
20?
that'd be great. That'd be
Okay,
great. Super.
thanks.
Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me. I really consider this to be an honor, and I'm grateful to have this opportunity. I have to tell you, I'm really impressed with what I've seen so far. You guys are 10 times, 100 times more organized than anything I've ever seen in the secular AA community. It makes me wonder if you really need to hear anything that I have to say. But Jim wanted me to talk about basically, how the secular AA thing started. How did we come up with this name? What kind of challenges have we had and how we have overcome them, and maybe what I think that we could have done differently. And what I thought I would do is I'd talk a little bit about the history of agnostics and atheists in AA for just a little bit, and some of the background behind the history of secular AA meetings. And then when we get into what's going on currently, I'm going to speak a lot from my personal experience from 2014 onward. And I want to just put out there that this is my perspective of events that have occurred, and other people who've experienced the same events will have a different take on it. But so keep that in mind. But here we go. So um, agnostics and atheists have been part of Alcoholics Anonymous since its founding. Actually, you could even say that Bill Wilson described himself as an agnostic before his white light experience in Towns Hospital. The Even in the very beginning, when these groups were starting out, we had a bit of a difference in AA as far as the spiritual nature and a secular nature. So, in other words, Bill's groups in New York City were a lot more secular than Dr. Bob's groups in Akron. Dr. Bob's groups really stressed, the praying and religious stuff, whereas the groups in New York were stressing service and helping others. So there was a bit of a difference. But in the very early days, there were a couple of atheists that were involved with the very founding of Alcoholics Anonymous. One of those is Jim Burwell. Jim Burwell was in the discussions early on about the Big Book, and he was really concerned that the Big Book was going to be too religious. The program was going to be too religious, and it was. I mean, they were in the early days. If you look at the manuscripts of the stuff that they changed, the book was really going to be more instructive and more specific about a religious deity, a god. And so Jim was instrumental in putting the phraseology and the steps, God as we understood him, or higher power. And Bill Wilson later recognized the contribution of Jim and other atheists with helping to make AA more accessible and widen the gateway to other people. So that we've always had that. Another person was Hank Parkhurst. He is the author of the chapter To the Employers in the Big Book. And so he was a very successful business person, and he was responsible for helping get the Big Book out there. Some historians say that the Big Book might not have been successful or as read as much if Hank wasn't there promoting it. He helped Bill come up with this work publishing organization that so that the profits of the Big Book would be realized by Alcoholics Anonymous. And to this day, I mean, that is what has been funding AA for the most part, is sales of the Big Book. So he was an atheist. I've also heard that Marty Mann, who is, I think she's known as the first woman to find sobriety in AA, considered herself agnostic. But later I heard that she became more spiritual, so I don't know. But that's really common in our community. It's really hard to peg us down. One thing that I've learned over the years is that you can be an atheist in Alcoholics Anonymous or any 12-step program for that matter, and one atheist or agnostic is going to experience and describe the recovery different from any other atheist or agnostic. One of the differences in our community that sometimes causes some controversy is just how important is spirituality in our recovery. For some of us, it has no role at all, and for others, it's really important. And I think that for the most part, we just allow each person to find their own comfort level with that. But secular AA meetings have been going on since at least 1975, and maybe earlier. I sponsored somebody who got sober in the 1970s, and he told me that there were AA meetings for atheists in St. Louis in the 1970s when he was getting sober, and I found that really surprising. And it would be interesting to know, what was happening. But it's not unusual to think that that would happen because since early days, AA members of similar backgrounds and experience were coming together to support one another. So we have LGBTQ groups, we have groups for lawyers, we have groups for doctors. These special purpose groups are really important because people with a common experience could come together and support each other. So it wouldn't be surprising that atheists or agnostics would do the same thing. Now, we do know, though, there was an event that happened in 1974 when Don W. gave a talk at a Unitarian Universalist church in Chicago. And his talk was titled, An Agnostic in AA, How It Works for Me. And when he was giving that talk, there was a pastor of the Unitarian Universalist church who heard him and thought it was wonderful. And he suggested that Don start a AA meeting for agnostics and atheists at that church. And that's what he did. And he called it Atheists and Agnostics in AA, or Quad A. And that was the first that we know of specific group for agnostics and atheists in Alcoholics Anonymous. And Quad A still exists to this day in the Chicago area. There are still a number of these groups, and they call themselves Quad A, Atheists, Agnostics, and AA. So they're still going on. And then in the 1980s, these meetings began to grow. There were two people in Los Angeles who started a group that they called We Agnostics, and that would be Charlie P. and Megan D. And it was in 1980 that they founded the We Agnostics group in Los Angeles, California. I think they're actually in Hollywood. And those groups began to grow. Charlie P. later retired and moved to Austin, Texas, where he started these groups in the 1980s. And those groups are still existing to this day. And then separately, in New York City, there were some people in 1986 who founded a group called We Atheists, and that would be Ada H., David L., and John Y., and that was in 1986. They later changed the name of that group to We Humanists, and I think that group is still meeting to this day. So that's kind of a rough thing that was going on. This is in the 1980s, so this is obviously prior to the internet. So all of these groups were acting independently of one another. They didn't know that each other existed. The groups in Hollywood and Austin, they didn't know that there were groups meeting in New York or Chicago. It was all happening at the group level, autonomous and independent of one another. So this began to change as the internet became, as we started going online and communicating that way. And one event that had a lot to do with the growth of secular AA were the attacks in New York City on September 11th, 2001. What happened then is there was a growing community of agnostic groups in New York City, and they were concerned that after the attacks, they were going to have difficulty meeting and finding each other. So they created a website to help the groups find each other, and that became an international directory of secular AA meetings around the world, because people would find their website, this New York City website of these AA meetings, and they'd say, hey, would you list my meeting? So they had this list of these meetings that no one before knew about, of all these secular groups, and we were finding each other. So, and I don't know when they started talking about it, but there were two women in Hollywood, Pam W. and Dorothy H., who became friends at the We Agnostics group in Hollywood, California. And they noticed that at their meetings, there were a lot of tourists coming to their meetings who had never experienced an agnostic meeting before. And they would at the end of the meeting, they said, wow, this meeting was wonderful. This is great. I never knew these things existed. And Pam and Dorothy were surprised because this is all they knew. This is the only type of meeting they knew. And they asked themselves, are there others out there like us? And that's when they discovered the New York site, and that there were others out there with them. So Dorothy and Pam said, let's throw a big party. Let's invite these other secular groups together for a conference. And they did that. And they called it the We Agnostics and Freethinkers in AA International Conference. And that was held in Santa Monica, California in November 2014. And I was able to attend that event. So I met Dorothy before that. I was finding my own way as an atheist in AA, and I had a friend in Omaha by the name of RJ, and she and I were in a Google group, just her and I and a guy from Minneapolis, and we'd sit around and we'd talk about being an atheist in AA, and RJ and I were both kind of tech geeks, and we had these amazing dreams of how we wanted to transform AA and rewrite all the literature and all this stuff. But we had a lot of ideas, and it was fun to talk with her. I felt a little bit rebellious, and then Dorothy.
Gentle reminder, John, that's 10 minutes.
Oh, wow. Okay. I'll speed it up. So
So
anyway,
you have 10 more.
Dorothy came along and joined our group, and she told us about this conference that they were creating in Santa Monica, and that gave us an opportunity to do something. And she mentioned an idea that she wanted to propose to the conference, and that idea was to have a central organization that she would call WAFT Central, that would be like a service entity for all these agnostic groups. So I went to this conference in Santa Monica, California, and it was an amazing experience. This is the first time that I'd ever been around so many people who were looking at their recovery in a secular way. It was an amazing experience. Now, there was some controversy before this because we invited the former chair of the General Service Conference of Alcoholics Anonymous to speak at the meeting, and he happened to be a reverend. But he's also a friend of secular people, of atheists and agnostics in AA, and he gave a wonderful speech there about the importance of inclusivity. But there was some controversy. People said, how dare you have a reverend speak at our conference for agnostics and atheists? But he was the chair of the General Service Conference. So there has always been some controversy, and we still have that to this day. We have a group of people who want absolutely nothing to do with any sort of religion or spirituality. And then we have another group that is, and I think it's a larger group, that wants to be more part of working with an AA. The people who started that conference, it was really important for them to be identified with Alcoholics Anonymous. That's why at that conference, not only did you have the Reverend Ward Ewing, but you also had at that time, the general manager of the General Service Office speak at the conference as well. So it was really important to them. Anyway, it was a very, very successful conference. But at that conference, there was a person who said, you know what, you're calling this We Agnostics and Freethinkers in AA. What about us atheists? They added the name. Atheists. So they changed the name to We Agnostics, Atheists. They added an A to it, WAFTIAC. And they decided to have the next conference in Austin, Texas in 2016. And that was decided by a group of people at the conference. On a side note, Dorothy's dream of the WAFT Central, the organization that would serve us all, was never discussed openly at the conference, but it was discussed behind closed doors, which was a mistake. And I was one of those people in the closed doors. And we all decided that we were going to build a website and we were going to have this organization. But keep in mind, it was a small group of people and not the entire organization that was agreeing to do this. And I think that was a mistake. But we created WASP Central, which was, again, going to be a service organization. And there was some controversy within us about, how involved do we want to be? Do we want to be independent of AA? Do we want to work within AA? How much of a service entity do we want to be? There was a certain amount of dysfunction, and eventually WASP Central just wasn't able to continue. So in 2016, I still had this dream of having this organization, and I purchased a couple of domains, seculara.org, seculara.com, and I still had this idea that we should have our own infrastructure, because who knows, someday we might just want to do our own thing. And so I brought this idea to the conference in Austin, and I did donate the Secular AA domains to them. And then they had a business meeting, and they decided to change the name of the organization from We Agnostics, Atheists, and Free Thinkers in AA to Secular AA. And that's how that came about. And the idea behind that was to just be more inclusive, because the idea is that it's not just for atheists and agnostics, but it's just for anybody who wants to have a secular path to their recovery. So we decided to change it to that name, and then we had a conference in the next one was in Ontario, Toronto, and that was a successful conference as well. What else should I say about that? So I will tell you that what went really well at these conferences is the connecting with other people. We did a really good job after the conference in Santa Monica.
5 more minutes.
Okay. I'm going to wind up going all the way back down to where we're at today. I would say that ultimately, if there's anything that we could have done different, my feeling is that we should have stressed group autonomy and involvement with the AA general service structure over doing our own thing. We're pretty much welcomed at in the general service structure of Alcoholics Anonymous. They want us to participate, and we have participated to a large degree, and I think that should be encouraged more than just having our own service structure. And if I could have done anything different, or if I think we could have done anything different as a community, it would have been to stress that with the local groups. Because one problem that we have today is people that are new to these meetings still think of themselves as something other than AA. You hear people talk about secular AA and traditional AA. I'd much rather it be that we are AA. We just have secularly formatted AA meetings. And if we stress that more, then I think that it would be better for everybody. But I'm going to conclude. I'm going to give you a link to an article I wrote where I got a lot of this talk from, and I'm going to read to you the conclusion that I had from the article that I wrote. This is just a quote from something I wrote some time ago. From our earliest days, arguing for a softening of the religious language in the 12 steps, to our fights for inclusion, we have had those. We did talk about that. To our battles with intergroups, and we've had them, and our battles with each other, we've reached a point in our history whereby we are no longer some fringe group within AA. We are as mainstream AA as any other special interest group. And that's a big deal, because that's how we will widen the gateway to recovery for others, and that will ultimately save lives, including our own. So I guess, hopefully, I've reached our 20 minutes. And I'll conclude with that. Thank you.
Okay, you still have a few more minutes, but this will take us to questions, which everyone
good.
will appreciate. Thank you so much, John. I know I learned a lot from your history and what you shared. So we'll be using the raise hand function, and we'll call on people in the order hands are raised. Please try to keep your questions succinct so we can get to as many as possible. And I see that, who is up first? Salem. Jenny's up first, and then Salem.
John, thank you so much for the overview of the history. It was really interesting. I got so much out of that. One of the issues in OA is that we're not allowed to use outside literature at our meetings and outside steps. And from what I understand, AA is okay with you doing that. Is that true?
Yes,
And
yes, it is. It is. So the General Service Office, they don't take any position on what individual groups do. So individual groups are completely autonomous, can do whatever they want to. Just because conference is approved, literature is approved by the General Service Conference doesn't mean that others that haven't been approved can't be read. So yeah, it's common for secular AA groups to use outside literature. My group in particular does, but when it comes to the steps, we leave it to each individual person to interpret for themselves how they want to work the steps. And there's an abundance of literature that helps do that.
yeah, I just feel like that's a bigger struggle that OA has, is that we are not allowed to do that. And so it really makes secular OA kind of have to be separate.
Yep.
Anyway, thank you
That's
so
a
much.
real challenge.
Pass.
Thanks, Jenny. Salem, you're up.
Hi, John. My question is also literature related. I heard Jeffrey Munn in a gathering a little while ago, author of Staying Sober Without God. And it kind of as he framed it, it sounded like, there was nothing like that out there. And so he wrote that book, and it's a good book. But how would that be? I mean, you're describing a 45, 46-year trajectory of secular AA or agnostic atheist AA. How extensive is the literature at this point?
It's pretty extensive. I don't know when we first started getting this type of literature, but I know that one of the earliest books was written in the 1990s, and it was I'm going to forget the name of it for whatever reason. I'll put it up there later, but it was written by two women, Martha Cleveland and someone else, Arlys G. And it was anyway, the Secular 12 Steps is what it was called, A Secular Guide to Recovery. And it was a wonderful book, and it was republished by Roger from AA Agnostica back in 2011 or whatever. So back in the 1990s, we had that. And then recently, we've had many other books that were written by other people, individual AA members. As far as the rewording of the steps, that's been going on for quite some time too. In fact, any of us in a 12-step program, we always have to ask ourselves what those steps mean to us anyway. So even if we just mentally reword it, we do that. But I believe that, and I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that the groups in Chicago were coming up with their own wording. And if you go to the AA Agnostica website, they have all kinds of alternative steps. Native Americans wrote their own version of the steps even.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Susan, you're up next.
Thank you. I've been many years trying to get going some sort of secular OA. I'm trying to lower my hand, sorry. And I wonder, you personally, do you find that, well, I said to myself at one point, what's so important about creating a non-religious group where people are comfortable? Okay, if it's, not happening so much, so be it. So my question to you is, do you ever feel overpowered by the secular part of your program as opposed to the 12-step part? Or has it just been, and has it always been fully integrated if it is now? In other words, do you believe you're spending too much time trying to get the secular movement going as opposed to working the step part of the program?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would say that each individual group goes through its own evolution. So, our group early on, I realized why it was important to have the group, because people were finding us who either left AA a long time ago because they didn't feel comfortable or welcomed. And we also had people that had actually been traumatized by religious experiences growing up. And so it would be triggering for them to have a list of God stuff to look at. So we had those people. And then what happened over time, though, we got younger people coming into the group who had never had any experience with AA at all, but were interested in a secular alternative, and they have no idea what any other type of AA meeting looks like. But when it comes to I guess I would answer your question by saying that over time, I think groups find a comfort level where they're not so much focused on being secular, And it begins to look like almost any other AA meeting, except for you're not praying and you're not using the religious terminology, and you're free to use out any other literature. But it doesn't seem like there's an effort to be secular within the group level. Now, when you get outside the group level and you do organizations like putting on a conference, then you might have some controversy about just how secular are we and how involved with these steps are we. But at the group level, it's usually worked out pretty easily.
So you never questioned yourself, why am I putting all this effort into secular as opposed to the steps?
No. Well, I guess I could do the two things together. In fact, they did go together for me. So like the first thing that I did after I realized I was an atheist is I went to the big book and I asked myself, how am I going to make this thing work? And what I discovered is when I would read a paragraph in the big book, I would read the concrete action, the things that we actually experience or do. And then right after that would be, oh, and God is great, by the way, and I could cross out all the God stuff. And what would be left in that book was the practical action. And then I began to rewrite the steps in my own words, my own language. And so to me, the two melded together. Now, the problem was at my home group that I was attending before I started this other one, they didn't welcome my new view. But now I think it's much more accepted by the outside AA. So I don't really see a struggle with it. I see that the two have kind of come together for me personally and in my group. And it does differ though but by individuals, groups, and where they are located.
Great. Thank you so much, John. That's great to hear from you. Let's all give John another round of Zoom applause and
Thank
unmuted cheers. Yay. Thank you.